Bamba, and Matt Brady.
For auditor, voters will choose between Timothy M. O'Brien and Eric J. Clark.
For clerk and recorder, the choice is Paul D. Lopez.
For council member at large, voters will vote for two of the following candidates: Travis Leiker, Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, Penfield Tate, Sarah Parody, Jeff Walker, Marty Zimmerman, Will Chan, Dominic A. Diaz, Tim Hoffman, and write-in candidate Janelle Jenkins.
For Councilmember District 1 in far northwest Denver, voters will choose between Ava Truckee and Amanda Sandoval.
For Councilmember District 2 in far southwest Denver, the candidates are Kevin Flynn, Chris Hare, and Tiffany Cadill.
Voters in West Denver, Council District 3, will choose between Jamie Torres and write-in candidate David Roybal.
Voters in District 4 in far southeast Denver will have a new council member to fill an empty seat. The choices are Tony Pigford and Diana Romero Campbell.
Voters in Council District 5, which is in East Denver, will elect one of the following: Amanda Sawyer or Michael Hughes.
District 6 voters in southeast Denver will have one choice for council member: Paul Cashman. He is running unopposed.
There is another open seat, this time in Council District 7 in central and southwest Denver. Voters will choose between Nick Campion, Flor Alvidrez, Adam Estroff, Arthur May, and Guy Paget.
Voters in District 8 in northeast Denver will fill another open seat and choose between Christian A. Stewart, Tyler Drum, Leslie Twarogowski, Chantel M. Lewis, Brad Revere, and write-in candidate Rita Lewis.
The choices in District 9 in North Denver are Candy C. DeBaca, Quan Atlas, and Daryl Watson.
District 10 voters in central and northwest Denver will have the choice of Margie Morris, Shannon Hoffman, Chris Hines, and Noah Kaplan.
Council District 11 in far northeast Denver can vote for the unopposed candidate, Stacy Gilmore.
Hey Denver, the decision is yours on April 4th. Make your voice heard by voting in the 2023 municipal election. Stay up to date on the candidates and the issues you'll see on your ballot at denverdecides.org. There you'll find Denver's most complete guide to help you choose your next mayor, city council members, and more. Candidate profiles, live candidate forums, and ballot issue breakdowns can all be found at denverdecides.org. Denver Decides, where Denver voters turn to get informed.
I vote because I feel empowered by the opportunity to vote on issues that affect not only me, but all members of my community, including those who can't vote. Our votes matter a lot, and I'll be voting this election, and I hope you will too, Denver.
Welcome to the Budget and Policy Committee of Denver City Council. This session of the Budget and Policy Committee begins now.
Everyone. Welcome to the Budget and Policy Committee meeting of Monday, March 20th. I'm Councilwoman Torres. I represent Council District 3. We don't have anyone online for introductions. We have one briefing today on the codification of safe outdoor spaces. But before we start that, let's do some introductions and we will start to my left.
Good afternoon, Robin Kinich at large.
Good afternoon, Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver's District 2.
And good afternoon, Paul Cashman, South Denver, District 6.
Kendra Black, District 4.
Good afternoon, Joel Clark, District 7.
Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Chris Hines, Perfect 10.
Thank you so much. We've got, again, community planning and development presenting codification of safe outdoor spaces, but we do have our sponsors from council. So I'd like to turn it over to Councilwoman Kinich and Councilman Hines to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I don't know if we can call up the presentation just for council members in the system so they can follow along. I know some of our screens are not working in the chambers, but I don't see it here on our screens in front of us on the Legistar system. So yes, thank you very much. But I know also our Legistar system does not have it queued up. We're still stuck on the attendance screen. So we have our central council is helping to staff today. So thank you very much. So I am co-sponsoring this along with Councilman Hines, and we are also working with Libby Kaiser from Community Planning and Development today. And before we begin talking about the actual text amendment, I want to just remind everyone of the context of our approach to homelessness in Denver, which is that permanent housing is the actual solution to homelessness in Denver. And that permanent housing is something that the city of Denver is funding. We have a presentation coming to safety on Wednesday, and we actually have an update. When we passed the sales tax for reducing homelessness, the pipeline that we conservatively estimated having funding for at that time was 1,800 supportive housing homes for those leaving homelessness. And what you're going to hear on Wednesday is actually that we now have a conservative pipeline of 2,500 supportive housing homes that we believe we have funding for in the host funded pipeline through all the sources that we have put together in the city. That's really significant. It's also not yet enough to solve for everybody experiencing homelessness today and those we know that fall into homelessness through eviction, through housing instability, through rising rents that we cannot regulate at the city level. And so that question of how we deal with interim crises and how we deal with interim homelessness while we continue to build that permanent housing is what this text amendment is about addressing. We also have about 2,000 people a day using structured shelter. So we have this pipeline of permanent housing, and then we have these structured shelters. There are those falling between the cracks, and that's what we are here to talk about today. And so we begin with that framework and the pipeline of what we are filling the gap for. And I just want to credit the community who was a part of developing this proposal back in 2020. We had long had a conversation about what regulated encampments or regulated alternatives to shelter might look like. And it took a very collaborative conversation to envision something that was staffed, managed, and based on some models that were happening in other cities early in the pandemic, and in some cases had been around in other cities prior to the pandemic, to really engage with community planning and development to come up with what was an emergency unlisted use. And so that was a set of partners who really engaged deeply. I was at the table with another council office. Council District 9 was at the table. We also had partners from Community Village Collaborative, St. Francis Center, Salvation Army, and other members of Denver Homeless Out Loud who were a part of that conversation. And so I really want to say it was a collaborative conversation that took re-examining prior city positions that really came it together. So I'm going to turn it over now to Councilman Chris Hines to begin the presentation.
Well, all right. So let's just talk a little bit about what this text amendment is. As probably everyone here knows, when we created the concept of safe outdoor spaces in tiny home villages, we did it as a temporary, a quick fix because COVID had descended upon us by the end of 2020, and so we wanted to create this fix, which was an important slice of the spectrum of homelessness, and we realized that we had a gap in that spectrum, and so in November of 2020, the zoning administrator issued a temporary use determination for campsites in thanks to COVID-19. And if we do nothing, that temporary determination will expire at the end of this year, which, as we know, we have a new mayor coming soon, and part of the impetus for making this move now is that just as we know, it takes a little bit of time for us to get up to speed as we became new city council members. It will take time for the new mayor to get up to speed as well. And so the thought process was, let's address this before the election, so that the mayor can focus on other mayor things, and we can make sure that we have this needed step in the spectrum of our a step in our spectrum from fully unsheltered, unhoused to fully housed. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in the last 2+ years that we've had safe outdoor spaces, we've had 8 sites that have provided shelter for 516 individuals. 180 of them have transitioned into permanent housing. I know that District 10 hosted the first 2 safe outdoor spaces. There was some resistance. I think that's putting it very lightly or kindly, but once residents in District 10 realized that safe outdoor spaces were not more of the same, that they were actually something new and different, we certainly got a lot of outreach about how do we get more safe outdoor spaces back into District 10. So in addition to safe outdoor spaces, this text amendment talks about safe parking spaces and also tiny home villages. And we put them all together into one package called temporary managed communities. And part of it was because they were created separately, they kind of had slightly different rules and regulations, and putting them all together as temporary managed communities makes it more uniform and allows community planning and development to focus more on the idea of spectrum from homelessness into housing, and instead of the one-offs from the different kinds of temporary managed communities. Sorry, there was one other thing in the last slide. So they've all been managed by nonprofits so far, including staff, sanitary facilities, and supportive services. Sorry, now the next slide.
So I'm going to jump back in here. So let's just talk for a second then about what the text amendment will encompass. So it will encompass tents like the igloo shelters you've seen. It will encompass structures, whether they're a tiny home or like the pallet shelters that we're experimenting with, maybe new technologies that we haven't seen yet. It will include a vehicle or an RV that you might see at a safe parking site. So it'll include all of those, let's call them sleeping units, right? And that it includes also the common areas, whether those common areas might be for staff, it might include the bathrooms, or includes the service areas where folks do common things. And I think that the idea is that, you know, they then can all kind of be regulated fairly similarly, as Councilman Hines mentioned. If we can go to the next slide, the definition is really important here. Thank you. So we did want to clarify why we are defining it as nonprofit organizations or government entities. First and foremost, this is to serve people experiencing insecurity or needing social services of some sort. And so mission-driven is really what makes the most sense here. This is not for someone who's going to charge a fee for service. A profit motivation just probably doesn't make sense to introduce for this type of temporary. These are still temporary sites. We'll get to that in a minute, but they're not forever sites. And so that is one reason for nonprofit or government entities. Second of all, right now, Denver is the primary funder of these sites, but you may recall that the first 2 sites started without any Denver funding. The source for those funds were philanthropic, and philanthropic entities only fund nonprofits. They don't fund for-profit entities. So it's hard to imagine what a source of funding would be. They are not allowed to fund for-profit entities, and we want these sites to be managed with services. And so if they are not able to get funding from from foundations and other sources, it's hard to imagine how they would provide the successful and deep services that we expect. It does not mean, however, that sites have to be owned by nonprofits. We've already used sites that were owned by other types of entities, right? The applicant for this permit needs to be the nonprofit operator or the governmental operator. But the site itself can be owned by a company or a corporation or a private person. They just simply need to have a lease then or an agreement with the nonprofit who's going to operate the site. So we are not taking any piece of land out of consideration for a site by virtue of who the permit applicant is. The permit applicant just needs to have permission to use that site. So you could have all kinds of partnerships, but that is something that we did get some feedback and questions about, so wanted to clarify that piece. And then you see the other pieces of the definition. It includes operational management. This is not a self-managed site. You have to have a central operator who's managing the site and providing all of these types of expected services. And I think that with that, we've covered most. I do just want to say one more thing. I think council members know this, but we always have members of our community who are listening. Who specifically are we catching with the gap here? Just to refresh ourselves, individual sleeping units provide something that our congregate shelters do not, and that is autonomy. This is a place where folks who are going to congregate shelters typically are losing their autonomy in terms of the time they go to sleep or wake up. They're losing their privacy, sleeping in a group room. So the reason why these sites have been successful in getting someone who might otherwise be homeless on the streets is because of that autonomy. It's a little more private and a little more independent in terms of their ability to determine their hours of sleeping and wakefulness and their privacy. So that's number one. Secondly, individual sleeping units can accommodate couples, whether they be LGBTQ couples or heterosexual couples who are not allowed to sleep together in congregate shelters. Some of our hotel motel options have been able to accommodate couples, but very few. And none of our congregate shelters right now are accommodating couples. So couples who are often sleeping unsheltered homeless today are able to use safe outdoor spaces and safe parking. So that is a significant group that these sites are capturing and keeping out of street homelessness. Third, you can see this in the prior picture. If you'll go back to slide, you know which one it is, Libby, but slide 4, pets. Right? These sites are, our shelters make accommodations for pets in kennels, some of them in separate areas, which is very different than having your pet with you. And it's only certain kinds of pets, the safe outdoor spaces and the safe parking. A lot of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness have a pet they do not want to be separated from. And so the accommodation of pets, these are things we've struggled with in congregate shelter. So that's the who. Right? So it is a text amendment. It's technical and it's zoning speak, but I just want to make sure we center it in the who we are filling this gap for with this text amendment. So with that, I will turn it over for all of the technical zoning information to Libby Kaiser, who will do a very good job at it. Thanks.
I am Libby Kaiser with CPD, and thanks much to our council sponsors for providing that overview. With me today is also Polly Kyle from HOST, who's been working on this project as well and can answer any questions after the presentation. And so on the next several slides related to our approach to these proposed regulations, you'll see these 3 boxes presenting the existing zoning regulations for temporary tiny homes, as well as the regulations that were within the temporary use determination that expires at the end of this year. And I'll go through how we arrived at the proposed regulations by blending the previous ones. And before I move on, it's important to know what we mean by temporary. And so currently, temporary tiny home villages are allowed to occupy a particular site for a maximum of 4 years. And yet, regardless of how long they stay, once they vacate the site, they cannot return to it for 4 years. And moving forward, we're introducing some flexibility that would allow a temporary managed community to, while being limited to a maximum of 4 years at one site, if they were only there for 1 year and they vacate, then they would only have to wait another year before they could come back. So making it kind of a little more of a one-for-one give and take. And these temporary managed communities would be allowed in most zone districts within the current Denver zoning code as well as former chapter 59. However, there are some use limitations in our less intense residential districts such as single unit, 2 unit, and row home zone districts. And currently they have to be accessory to a civic, public, or institutional use. That will be the same moving forward. However, we are also going to allow them on vacant corner lots with a minimum zone lot size of 5,000 square feet, or at least one of the intersecting streets as a collector or arterial street like a Monaco Boulevard or Monaco Parkway or an Alameda Avenue. Then currently within these use limitations, there's also a maximum number of sleeping units that's allowed in tiny home villages, and that's capped at 30 units. And we're proposing to lift that maximum and instead allow the maximum to be determined by the zone lot size and structure separation requirements in our building and fire codes. And then for operational requirements, tiny homes and safe outdoor spaces have so far required that an operational plan be submitted as part of the zoning permit. And this plan typically includes specific details regarding how the site will be staffed and maintained, and these details often don't relate directly to zoning and are difficult for our zoning inspectors to enforce. And so now we're proposing to require that the use be operated by a nonprofit or government entity, which would manage and maintain these sites and provide supportive services, as Councilmember Kniech was describing earlier. In addition, if deemed necessary, the zoning administrator could attach conditions to a zoning permit, for example, specifying specific lighting standards that would have to be met. And this conditional permitting is already built into our code as part of the typical zoning permit review process. Finally, it's important to mention that beyond the zoning regulations, in order to receive funding, an operator does need to partner with host via a contract that establishes management obligations, and Polly can provide more details regarding these contracts after the presentation. Then looking at the site design, we've introduced some flexibility into the setback requirements. Temporary tiny home villages currently must be set back 20 feet from a primary street in single unit, 2 unit, and row home districts. We are now proposing a 0-foot setback along the primary street, since this use is temporary and we're not trying to maintain a certain neighborhood character with permanent structures being placed in a consistent location on a corner lot or on a zone lot. We've also heard from operators that this flexibility is key for them to design their sites efficiently while being responsive to certain constraints like easements and whatnot. And then finally, we are introducing the ability of the zoning administrator to suspend zoning code standards and procedures during emergencies that threaten public health or life, so that the temporary managed communities could be quickly deployed if needed. And this is similar to the allowance that applies to permanent residential care facilities that can increase their capacity in emergencies. To end, we are in the middle of this text amendment process. A public review draft was published a couple weeks ago, will be available for a couple more weeks, and our city council hearing is on June 5th. So today we'd appreciate any questions or comments you'd like us to consider before we finalize these regulations. Thank you.
Council President, may I?
Mhm.
Thank you, Ms. Kaiser, for your presentation. One other community that I just wanted to chat about is before we had safe outdoor spaces, there were only 14 beds in the Denver metro area for people who use wheelchairs to get around. And safe outdoor spaces provided a valuable addition. It quintupled the amount of space that we have for people who use wheelchairs just with the addition of the safe outdoor spaces. Any of the tents are the openings wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair, and any of the tents can accommodate someone who uses a wheelchair just with the addition of a ramp, which is pretty transformative. Sure, the 48th Avenue shelters technically could accommodate people with disabilities, or specifically people with physical mobility impairments, but the buses that we have that go from downtown to the shelters, we're still working on having them become wheelchair accessible, but they aren't currently. So this is another community that safe outdoor spaces and temporary managed communities have been a valuable addition to. So thank you, Council President.
Thank you very much. Councilman Kenich, any final comments?
Yes, I just wanted to let council members know that we do have several providers here with us in person and on Zoom, just in case there are questions. Polly Kyle is an expert on the funding side of the model and, the work that Host does as the contracting partner. But if we get into the details of operations, we have Terrell Curtis, who is the executive director of the Safe Parking Initiative. And then online, we have several of the operators of the safe outdoor spaces that we can acknowledge on Zoom if that technology is working, if needed. So we're just making sure that that resource is available if it comes up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to welcome Councilwoman Sandoval to the meeting. We'll start with questions. We've got Councilwoman Sawyer first in queue.
Thanks, Madam President. So question about who the decision-making authority is. At the end of the day, if an entity applies for a safe outdoor space or a tiny space, I'm so glad you brought up the corner of Alameda and Monaco, where there's an empty 5,000 square foot lot right now. Who applies for that location?
But who intends to operate the site would apply for that location with permission from the landowner.
With the permission from the landowner, the nonprofit applies for that. And who is the decision-making entity on a yes or a no?
Our zoning administrator would issue the permit.
And who hires the zoning administrator?
The city does.
And is the zoning administrator an appointee position or career service position?
They are not appointed.
They're career service position. Okay. So one person hired by the HR department is the sole and final decision maker on whether a safe outdoor space is allowed in a certain location.
Ultimately, that's the zoning administrator is the term that we use in our zoning code that has the capacity to issue any permit for any of our allowed uses.
Okay.
There is also a community information meeting that is required for the applicants, and any comments, any concerns from the public that are voiced throughout that process would be weighed by the zoning administrator as well in issuing a permit.
Okay. So community information meeting, not a community discussion.
Correct.
Okay. And if neighbors were not supportive of this and did not want it, and the single entity making the decision is the zoning administrator, and the zoning administrator approves it, what is the process for appeal for a neighbor?
Yeah. Well,
Since we just kind of clarified this.
Good afternoon. I'm Kyle Dalton, Regulatory Planning Manager with Community Planning and Development. A decision of the zoning administrator can be appealed to the Board of Adjustment.
To the Board of Adjustment. Okay. And then after the Board of Adjustment, so what are the criteria that the Board of Adjustment would consider when considering whether to overrule the zoning administrator on something like this?
Oh goodness, and that's in flux as well right now with the text amendment that's being considered.
Well, it's actually not. May I speak?
Please
to
do,
it?
yeah.
So when Councilwoman Sandoval and I ran our amendment last time, the criteria for it is an error. So the zoning administrator can be overturned if they erred in their interpretation of the code, and that is still the standard. Nothing in the text amendment that we are running today makes any changes to that. The text amendment simply takes language out of the charter, but none of that in code is changing in the text amendment that's pending. It's still, the standard is an error. So appeals to the Board of Adjustment are for an error in interpretation of the code. If the zoning administrator erred, then they can be overturned. And then if there's a disagreement, then the appeal is to court. If someone feels that the zoning administrator erred, the Board of Adjustment doesn't overturn it, someone can then appeal that decision to court.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Kanicha. I really appreciate that clarification. So what, in the proposed changes to the setbacks and all of those different things in this amendment, that in this text amendment, how is it possible that the zoning administrator could ever be found to have erred, given the amount of flexibility that is written into this language?
That's a good hypothetical question.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great, thank you. And next up, Councilwoman Black.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Libby. I'm okay with a lot of this. I really struggle with normalizing people living in tents outside in Colorado on parking lots that are very hot or very cold. But I'm in support of most of it. In fact, the only safe outdoor parking site in our whole city is it's been in my district for almost 2 years now, and it's fine and has helped some people, and there haven't been any issues with it. So I just have some questions about the safe outdoor camping sites. But before I ask those, Councilman Hines made some points about ADA accessibility. And I know this is not something that you would answer, but maybe you, Polly, I don't know, or someone from Host. Why don't we have buses and shelters that are ADA accessible? I mean, I find that shocking. And it seems like, you know, one of the main reasons we're having this conversation is because the shelters are not working. So I'm a broken record here, but why aren't we changing our shelters so that they can give people what they need, rather than, of course, I think it's inhumane for people to live outside. Can you tell me more about accessibility?
Yeah, I can start with that. Hi, everyone. I'm Polly Kyle with the Department of Housing Stability. We did issue an RFP recently. I think it's closed now, for ADA accessible buses to get folks to shelter that is ADA accessible. I don't know the status of the RFP, but I can find out and get back to you and let you know how that went and if we have folks selected to do that work.
And how many ADA accessible places are there for people to go to?
I'll get back to you on that question as well. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And so again, we are always hearing how our shelters are not serving people the way they need to be served. People want privacy, they want to be with their partner, they want to bring their pet, they want to store their stuff. And I understand all of those things, so I just don't understand why we can't have our shelters be adapted to change to serve that need, rather than having someone live in a tent outside, which I believe is inhumane. And I don't like the idea of normalizing living in a tent. I don't like the idea of explaining to friends who are visiting from another country, oh, the city pays for people to live in those tents in that parking lot. I mean, it does not feel right to me. I do not think that's the right solution. I'm fine with the tiny homes. I'm fine with the parking. But so I just have a few questions about the campsites. 8 sites, 2 years, 516 people, 180 have moved into permanent housing. Where are the other 336 people who have stayed in those tents?
Most of them are still occupying those spots. We're working on finding more permanent housing solutions for those individuals to be stabilized.
And what is the amount of time people stay, the range?
I had an average.
Okay, what's the average?
I think it's, I don't want to misspeak, so I'll get back to you on the average, but I have that number.
Okay, I'd like the range.
Okay.
Do we have a provider online who wants to raise their hand? If Tim, is there anyone online with their hand raised? Okay, if we have anybody online who would like to weigh in on that information, please raise your hand as a provider. Quika has her hand raised. Can we promote Quika?
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Councilwoman Black, for your question. So we've been currently in operation for 2 years. We've also recently had, funding through ARPA that have provided some emergency housing vouchers. So kind of our average is a little skewed right now. But before the emergency housing vouchers came in, we were averaging about 9 to 12 months stay. And then it's shortened recently to about 6 to 9 months. We anticipate with that, the removal of the funding for that will no longer be funded through ARPA. We anticipate our averages will last longer because, as we all know, there's a shortage of affordable and subsidized housing for folks with extremely low income.
Council President, we also have a second provider, Ian. Would it be possible to promote him as well to see if he has anything to add to that answer?
Yep, Tim will get the invite to promote him. He's ready. Go ahead, Tim.
Hello. I would agree with Quika. The answer varies widely. The average at our site at Barnum is lower. It's more like 4 to 6 months. And it really requires the active participation of the participants, as well as, again, the ability to have housing available.
That's it. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Quika and Tim. And I know we've talked about this a lot, but I would be interested also, you don't have to tell me right now, just remind me how much money we're spending on these. I was supportive of them when we were having an emergency, but I just feel like we need to move beyond tents here in the richest country in the world, that that's the solution we have. I just feel like there's got to be a better solution. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilman Cashman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just echo Councilwoman Black's. While I think we need every option available to us to keep people housed, be nice to move past this current set of options. Whoever can answer it or can get back to me, we're looking at lifting the total number of tents and basing it upon the size of the property with various fire safety requirements and access requirements. Whatever details I can get, do you know what that means, what fire is requiring of us?
So fire wouldn't regulate the spacing between cars that are in safe outdoor parking spaces. That would be up to the operator to make sure that there's sufficient access for people to get in and out of their car and space to maneuver around the site. For tents as well, like our typical igloo tents that serve as sleeping units on these sites, these fall underneath the threshold that is regulated by fire. So again, that's kind of more on a site-by-site operational determination on how they space.
I mean, by not, they don't reach the number of units that fire requires?
The size of the units, the square footage.
Oh,
of
the
those
square
units.
footage of the units.
Yep, so they typically start dictating the separation and setbacks once that tent hits 200 square feet.
Okay.
So your larger, more communal tents for gathering areas on the
Sure.
site. And then for your tiny homes and pallet shelters, it would typically be a 10-foot separation.
Okay. Good, thank you very much. My next question, I guess, for Ms. Curtis. Terrell, I'm just wondering what the status is of safe parking in Denver and Colorado right now. I know we've had the one site in Councilwoman Black's district, but how are
Yeah,
things?
thank you.
Yeah.
In Denver, actually in Denver proper, we have 2 lots right now, one in Councilwoman Black's district and one in Capitol Hill across the street from the Capitol. And I don't know whose district that is.
Okay.
It's, that one just opened about a month.
And how many vehicles are taking advantage of that site? Do we know?
Ultimately, if not already, there will be 12 at the one across from the Capitol. And I believe there's 8 at the church in Councilmember Black's office. And those are typically determined by the property owner.
Right. And moving forward, how do you see the landscape as far as availability of safe parking sites? Because I think they're as critical as the tent and tiny home villages.
CSPI is operating across 5 of the 7 metro counties. So there's 13 lots all in all. We can accommodate right now about 10% of the people who call us at any given time. So it's a very young organization, just now 3 years old. So we are working quickly to strengthen and stabilize so that we can continue to expand as needed, certainly in the metro area. We also provide technical advice across the state, and you name it, we've heard from it.
Sure. So in my time on council, when I asked how many people are actually sleeping on the street, I hear somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500, depending on the year and the climate and so on and so forth. What's your estimate of how many vehicles we need to park?
That one is challenging because it doesn't always get broken out in the data reports as to how many people were sleeping, under bridges and cars. I'm actually in the middle of trying to find that out right now because it is obviously important for us to know and all of our government funders.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all,
welcome.
Madam
Thank
President.
you.
Tara, before you leave, can you do an intro of yourself for our viewers real quick?
Oh, yes. I'm Terrell Curtis, Executive Director for the Colorado Safe Parking Initiative. I've been there since May. I know many of you from my prior work as ED at the Dolores Project.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And just want to kick to some of our experts who are joining us on Zoom. Kuika, I think you had your hand up and then wanted to see if Gray had any comment about either of Councilman Cashman's questions.
My comment was in regard to the fire safety spacing. So while the spacing isn't required for the unit in community planning and development, as an experienced operator, we have instituted a 5-foot spacing of our tents for fire safety.
Great, thank you, Kuika. Gray, did you want to make any comments before we move to our next questions?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up is Councilwoman Sandoval.
Thank you. I have a few questions regarding the text amendment. When the zoning administrator issues a permit, is there a time frame associated with a permit for either a tiny home village, a safe parking, or a safe outdoor site?
Yep, so they all fall under the same rules and regulations, and 4 years is the maximum that any would be allowed at one particular site. And then we're shifting a little bit from the current temporary tiny home villages in that if it only occupied a particular site for a year or 2, anything less than 4 years, and it subsequently vacated the site, then it could go back to that site after waiting for the same amount of time that it occupied the site.
Okay. And then it says the zoning administrator to attach conditions to the zoning permit. Can you give examples of what type of conditions that means?
Sure. So something that they might require is sufficient lighting around a site for safety concerns, or just even the user friendliness of the occupants of that site.
So if a condition, let's say lights, for example, let's say there is a condition that is attached to the permit and lights are not instituted like the condition said on the zoning permit, what's the recourse to make sure? So I'll give a different example. If there's a condition on a excise and license, liquor license, you can appeal to the liquor license and go through a process. What does the process look like if a condition is not met on the zoning administrator, on the permit that was issued by the zoning administrator?
And again, that process doesn't change within this text amendment. That defaults to our standard protocols for dealing with enforcement of someone not complying with their permitting requirements. And then if they wanted to be, if the operator wanted to
So
appeal
what I'm
that, it would.
asking you to do is, you keep using really general language that you and I know. I want to make sure the public knows. So dig down deeper what you just said. It would go into our normal enforcement. What is our normal enforcement for viewers who are watching, who don't understand what our normal enforcement is?
And that's a great question. Since I'm not within our kind of zoning inspection team, I can't describe that thoroughly, what their typical process is for that, but I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Kyle, do you know anything? Could you elaborate just a little bit? Like, you call 311, you call your council person?
I'll do the best I can to add a little more color here. Yeah.
Thank you.
So when someone has a complaint and lodges it either by calling 311 or filling it out online, our zoning neighborhood inspection services team is their first priority is gaining compliance, right? So they'll inspect the property, they'll check out what's going on and work with the permittee to seek compliance. If the permittee doesn't, there are steps that CNIS can take in terms of, issuing a notice of violation, giving them a couple chances before that can go on from there in terms of getting a citation or those sorts of things for correction. Those rarely happen because most folks agree, are trying to come into compliance and don't understand the condition they were permitted and that sort of thing. But those are the ways that the city works to gain compliance for folks.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Next up, I have, can someone define, we use a lot of wonky terms in here. We say operated by a government entity or quasi-governmental agency. And then on the map that is in the appendix, there's not that many. If you look, I'm sorry, the presentation's not numbered, but if you look at the map with the blue boxes, there's not that many. So can you talk to me about and define civic, public, or institutional uses?
So our civic, public, and institutional uses, again, we're not changing the definition of those. Those are defaulting to what exists in the zoning code, but those would be areas like schools, churches, government buildings, structures of that type, that would have to be the primary use on the zone lot in order to accommodate the temporary managed community within our single unit to unit in row home districts.
So you said school, churches,
government buildings.
And like federal government, just any type of government building?
Yep.
Okay. And they would be, and then other than that, and on this map, we don't have former chapter 59 on there, correct? Because Regis, one of the photos that you had on here was Regis, and it's under chapter 59. So it would, with that bridge amendment to former chapter 59, it would still be the same. It would be limited to civic, public, or institutional uses.
That, or, and we are working on the specifics of that bridge amendment to match up with the former residential districts, the former lower scale residential districts, but certainly this is intended to bridge to former chapter 59 districts, and these same limitations would apply to the lower intensity residential areas. So it could either be with a civic, public, or institutional use, or also located on a site that's on a corner that's at least 5,000 square feet, currently vacant, and bordered by arterials or collector streets.
Okay, and talk to me about the 5,000 square foot. Where did that number come from?
That number we discussed, that as a threshold, as well as increasing that threshold in doing this kind of spatial analysis, we felt like that was a good number to allow for just equity in the geographic places that these folks can locate on, as well as providing some flexibility for the operators. A lot of them have said that since they've been deploying this method over the last few years, they're trying to scale up. So 5,000 square feet might be too small, but we didn't necessarily want to rule that out.
And then on the on the picture that we had up of the 5,000. So on the next slide, when the red, are those the only areas that have 5,000 square feet or more?
These are
in the
today.
GIS?
Yeah, these are today. These are anticipated to fluctuate at any given time, since some of these vacant sites might be developed, others might open up. So this is just a snapshot as of last December.
Of where these sites could go with 5,000 square feet or more.
Yeah, these meet all those criteria.
And was there a consideration to start lower so that we had more availability? Because looking at this map, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of availability throughout Denver if we start at 5,000 square feet.
And based on our conversations with operators, they would be highly unlikely to go on anything smaller than 5,000 square feet, as it's just not going to be an efficient use of resources on anything smaller.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Council President, can I just chime in real quick? One possible risk of looking at this map is it doesn't have all the layers. So just to remind council members, first and foremost, this use is allowed on all commercial, industrial, mixed use, multifamily parcels. So that's the first layer of all the places it's allowed, right? Main Street, all those places, right? And then secondly, it's allowed in SUTU road home areas that are adjacent to civic uses, right? And so that's that second map with the blue on it. And so then the third map, it's where you have the 5,000 square feet corner lots. And so it's a little bit misleading to look at one map layer without the other two, right? So just wanted to kind of share that feedback and about why, you know, the red dots look very few, but you kind of have to look at the three map layers all together to kind of see the full number of areas where the use is allowed. And especially too, to see where the equity comes in. The civic use is actually where you create the most equity in terms of this being allowed across the city versus just in some neighborhoods, which is something that was really important in all the conversations about making sure that this is something that is not just available in certain neighborhoods, but citywide. That map with the, I don't see a slide number, but the one with the blue on it, I think really shows, you know, where the equity really is more citywide, and even a little bit to the red, right? You see it in more neighborhoods than just the multifamily zoning might without these other two layers. So thank you for allowing me to add that.
So can I request that, to your point, Councilman Kinich, I'm a super visual learner, and so it's hard for me to scroll through these just two maps. Can I have a map produced that has all the different layers on it so that I can understand? My concern is if this is public information, people are going to say that we don't have as much of an impact as we are because we are missing the industrial uses. Like if in Council District 1, on this map with the red or even with the blue, it's not very many. And so if we could have a layered approach, that would be really helpful for me to figure out like how big of an impact this is, because I support these. We've had them in Council District 1. I brought forward the text amendment to allow them in former Chapter 59, and had I not, it wouldn't have opened in Regis. And I have a lot of PUDs in Northwest Denver, which are, people don't always think of them as former Chapter 59, but they really are. The whole entire Elitch's redevelopment is a huge PUD. Regis is a PUD. So if I could see that map, that helps me understand the scale, just similar to like when we did expanding housing affordability, we had lots of maps. So I'm a map person. So the more information you can give me with maps, the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I failed to welcome Councilwoman Ortega to the meeting. Councilwoman Ortega, you're up for questions.
Thank you. Libby, I wanted to ask, first of all, is one of the conditions that they have to offer some services to the people on site? And can you give an example of what some of those services might be?
Sure. So it seems like the slides keep disappearing. But built into the definition for temporary managed community is this expectation that they would be operated by nonprofit organizations or government entities that would provide supportive services. So that could be help finding employment, help finding permanent housing. It could be access to food, hot meals a day, or access to a place to cook a meal. It's also housekeeping accommodations. So bringing in shower trucks at least weekly, providing on-site bathrooms, hand washing facilities, personal storage opportunities. So there's definitely that expectation. We don't require all of these things, but this is the flavor of the things that we would be looking for.
And that is part of their initial application to say, these are the services we'll be providing?
Not within the zoning permit itself, we're not requiring that information, but for a nonprofit to get funding from the city, they have to partner with host and enter into a contract that sets up those expectations.
Okay. And can you tell me if our workforce division is plugged in so that as people are looking to get back to work and the contractual relationships they have with other providers in the community that are helping excuse me, reskill and upskill individuals and connect them to employers that are looking for workers. Is that plugged in as part of the big picture of what we're doing, not just here, but maybe even for, you know, people that are in our shelters, in the motels, some of that? And I'm not sure if you're the right one to answer that question, but
I can't speak to that from zoning, but Polly or maybe some of our operators could also speak to that.
Okay, Polly, you want to give it a shot?
Kuika, I think, is prepared to answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Kuika, you're up. Did you hear the question?
Yes, thank you, Councilwoman Ortega, for your question. We do partner with workforce development at Denver Human Services. We partner with the SNAP to Success program. We have recently expanded into more specified job training programs like Grid Alternatives. So we work to engage as many job training programs or workforce development partners to provide that support for folks when they're ready to explore employment.
So is the data being tracked in terms of how many people are employed, and then as they are able to start saving money, I'm assuming that is assisting them in getting into housing opportunities. So who is tracking that data? Is that being done by hosts? I'm just curious if someone could share that information with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we provide two different pathways for income. So we engage folks at the beginning of their stay through our peer support program to do an intake on kind of what is their pathway, what is their income pathway, either it's disability or employment. And then we also provide exit counseling, which is preparing them for the transition to whatever housing opportunity they end up with. You know, it just depends on where they're at, what type of housing they're going into, whether it be permanent supportive housing, income, and such related data. We do collect that.
So I'm just curious to know if any of the data that's being tracked is showing if people are going into, if you recall, we made changes to the group living ordinance that will allow up to 5 unrelated people to live in a building. And I would just be curious to see if we have a way of tracking that, and if any of these individuals are going into those units that we created that opportunity for. Does anybody have any of that kind of data as well?
I'm not sure about anything specific to group living amendments.
Okay. It was intended to be a way of creating some truly affordable opportunities, especially for single individuals that might just need to be renting a bedroom, for example. So I was just curious about that. And then let me see, my last question is about whether or not we're tracking, like, we know we have a lot of people who have been folks that grew up in Denver that lived along the South Platte River. In Councilman Flynn's district, we had some that lived along the Gulch when that housing right at Federal near Florida was built, and those individuals were not allowed to be housed in that development. And I'm curious how we're ensuring that a lot of our chronic homeless that are not close to downtown are some of the same people that are gaining access to these housing opportunities, whether it's the safe open space sites or any of the housing that people are getting into. So can anyone address that?
I can address both of those questions too, as needed. So overall at the SOS, we've had a 27% increase upon exit of finances, so meaning that people have gained finances, whether that's employment or whether that's other social services to help sustain them as they're disabled or unable. I can also tell you that we directly work closely with outreach, the Denver Street Outreach Collaborative, as well as other agencies and city departments to outreach the communities in which we exist, as well as the outerlying community, to make sure that we are giving everyone an equitable opportunity at gaining access to the SOS. I know that in each of our locations, we have specifically gone to the trouble of trying to locate people who are experiencing homelessness in the neighborhoods at which we exist and providing them the opportunity and access to resources.
And I'm assuming that is tying into the vulnerability index data that is collected, identifying like who some of our at-risk people are that are likely to die on the streets unless we help get them in. So is that something else you can just sort of confirm?
Yeah, we definitely complete the vulnerability index, otherwise known as the VI SPDAT. We also do an entry intake, and then as well as an exit when they exit, noting any changes in income, any changes in status, whether they've identified issues like mental health or physical health, and how that's changed over time. And we track that all through the HMIS system that we utilize.
Great. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I moved Councilwoman Gilmore up just before we went into second round of questions. Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, Council President. Just wanted to reiterate Councilwoman Sandoval's request, and then also would like to, because there's going to be a bridge amendment to bring in the former Chapter 59 neighborhoods, I'd like to see that map before it comes forward. It seems like just good transparency that if you're gonna run a bridge amendment with it, that we'll be able to see additionally which sites would be utilized for both the civic and public and institutional use, and then the corner lots as well. So would like to see that additionally, and want to make sure I'm understanding. So the funding slide that's on slide 17, just quick math on it. It was 12.3 million that was allocated between the years of 2021 to 2024 is what you're looking at. And then the additional large amount was the 7.3 million. Is that appropriate to look at both of those as the?
Yeah, the total amount for all contracts that Host has done from 2021 through 2024 will be 12.3 million. The contract that was just approved is 7.3 million, which is ARPA funding. And then there's 225,000 in participatory budgeting funding for 3 new shower trailers.
Okay. All right. So a little bit over 20 million, it looks like, has been invested.
No, the 7.3 goes into that 12.3.
It's inclusive of it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the
Perfect.
total is 12.3.
Wanted to make sure about that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the
All right.
clarification.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Or Madam President.
Thank you so much. And I just have a really quick question just about where one of the provisions that we experienced, one of the issues that we experienced in District 3 Safe Outdoor Space was a fire. And there's some language about some of the fire expectations or fire code, and then some language about conditions that the zoning administrator applies. Are either of those inclusive of limiting flammable materials on any of the sites within any of the units?
That's not something specifically that we've discussed as being a potential condition, but I think if there was a lot of concerns voiced by folks that they were wanted to limit those conditions, we could look into that I imagine most of the tents are probably comprised of some flammable materials. So we'd have to look at the feasibility of how that would impact the functionality of a particular site too.
And I can follow up also with Quika offline about whether that's part of any of their own conditions that they apply to the safe outdoor spaces. Okay, thank you, Libby. Councilwoman Black?
Thank you. I just had a quick question. When someone is living in one of these tents, how are they heated? Or are they
Electricity
heated-
is provided to them.
So there's like a space heater in them?
I know Quika has her hand up,
There we go.
so she might be best positioned to answer this.
Yes, so we, thank you for the question. We provide fire safety rated space heaters. We also accommodate our safety checks through our tent checks that our site operations staff perform on a weekly basis. I would like to just address the fire question as well into this. So we convened a safety committee meeting where we established our new fire safety spacing. We are also looking into adding fire extinguisher balls in each tent as well. So it would immediately put out a fire once it reaches a certain temperature. And then also updated our tent check language for our site operations staff once they're completing their tent checks to make sure that folks are being held accountable for flammable materials in their tent. And they're also examining like how far away the space heater is from clothing or things that could potentially ignite fires. So we have updated all that language, and we have already instituted our fire safety spacing. Our new SOS in Montbello already has it. Our DHS SOS just completed it, and we are instituting it now at our Barnum SOS next.
Thank you so much, Quika. Councilwoman Black, you good? Okay. Councilwoman Sawyer?
Sorry, are we good now?
I can hear you fine.
Okay,
regardless.
perfect.
Yeah.
I can't see the light, so I can never tell if it's on or not. So just reiterating the request for former Chapter 59 map, most of Lowry is in former Chapter 59, and so it's very important for me to see that map, particularly if this was going to be bridged over to former Chapter 59. So that's number one. Number two, curious about the definition of the spaces that we're talking about. So governmental use, industrial use. What is the legal definition of those terms?
I'd have to follow up with you with the definitions from our code.
Okay, that would be really helpful because, for example, adjacent to a governmental use could be a park. And so my question is, are we talking about our city parks?
Mm-hmm.
And without more information on the exact definition of each of those terms, I have a lot of concerns about this. So if you have an answer to that, I would really appreciate it, but I would really like to see those definitions. Thank you.
I'll send them your way.
Thank you. Councilwoman Kinich?
Yes, thank you very much. I believe it's a building, and so we'll get clarity on that, but that has never been a discussion before about it being adjacent to open space. That is not a zoning that is allowed, and so I think that zoning is excluded. So there's two reasons it's excluded. One, first of all, it's SUTU row home zoning adjacent to a civic or institutional use. And a park would not be SUTU row home zoning. So by definition, that zoning would not be compatible. So I think the zoning answers that question.
Okay, thanks, Councilmember Kinich. I really appreciate that. Can follow-up question to you on that then?
Please, and then I'll go back in the queue with my own questions. But since I was first up here, I just thought I would close this out. So,
no, that's
yes.
great, because that is very concerning, and it was not clear to me at all that we're only talking about governmental uses adjacent to SUTU RH.
Yes.
But I guess I'm wondering then if that includes, so I guess I would need to be very clear on what exactly that does include. The reason I'm asking this question is because there's mayor's race going on right now, and a number of people have talked about solving our homeless crisis by using our parking lots at our rec centers and land adjacent to our rec centers to build housing. That's not something that is legal under our code, but it could be, and I just want to check and see whether that's something that is potentially up for discussion based on what we're talking about here.
We would have to check with Council President. Yes. I would question whether any rec center in the city is zoned SUTU or row home, or is commercial zoning or multifamily zoning. Any rec center that is zoned open space, this would not apply to, right? Whether it is in a designated park or not. So I just want to clarify, there's two issues. If it's in a designated park, then they have the charter issue. If it's not in a designated park, but it's otherwise zoned as open space, then it's not covered by this. So it would have to be, if it was zoned commercial, then we would have a discussion, right, about that. So that would be the only scenario potentially, and I think that would be a good discussion to have. It might be appropriate to have one of these in the parking lot of a rec center that was zoned commercial. But it's not even a discussion because, you know, I don't think under this particular place you've asked the question, it's not going to be zoned SUTU row home. The most frequent blue spots that you see on this particular map, I can tell you, are going to be churches, schools, or other government facilities. I think Denver Human Services is probably a classic example of the government building, but it could be, you know, other types of government facilities, but it's a lot of them are churches and schools. And again, you need a willing host, right? It's not, you know, it's not going to be against the will of a school. If the school doesn't want to host it, then there's no host. Does that help?
Yep, I think we're
okay, great. So I wanted to do a follow-up, and Councilwoman Sandoval, I was going to actually ask you if you can help me. I want to be clear that there are, I believe, already 2 bridge amendments in place. So I just want to clarify. On the first, so just to back up, we have an existing chapter in our code for temporary tiny home villages, and there is already a bridge amendment for those to Chapter 59. We are adopting all of this into that section and renaming it temporary managed communities. So first, there's already a bridge amendment to Chapter 59 there. Secondly, early in the pandemic, when this temporary unlisted use was issued, Councilwoman Sandoval sponsored a bridge amendment to Chapter 59 for this use. So there's already a bridge amendment to Chapter 59. So I want to be clear. There is already a bridge amendment to Chapter 59. We're having to merge those and, you know, sync them up, but we are not talking about a new bridge amendment to Chapter 59 that does not exist today, as far as I understand. So anyone from CPD or Councilwoman Sandoval can jump up and tell me if I'm incorrect, but I want to just clarify the record. We already have Chapter 59 bridge amendments for both pieces of this that we're bringing together, as far as I know.
That's correct, as I know it. I worked on the one for Chapter 59 for the safe outdoor sites that exists so that we can have them. So it already is there, and they can function, such as the one at Regis. Correct.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll work with the staff on bringing folks the maps that they need, but just to clarify, what we're doing today is moving things from the unlisted place that they live in the ether to the zoning code. Everything we're talking about already exists today. We're just bringing it into a new place, right? That's the simplest way to describe it for our community who's watching today. Not a lot new here. The second thing I wanted to ask about, because I think my colleagues asked some really important questions about why not fixing all of this in the shelter system? So I wanted to kind of ask Polly or the providers if they wanted to answer some of those early questions that colleagues asked. So the question was about, just solving for couples, pets, or the autonomy question in the shelter system. As I recall it, there was also an RFP put out for couples and pets in sheltering. I want to just set aside for a second the hotel motel question, because I think that we did some experimenting with that. So let's just set aside hotel and motel for a second. It was my understanding that we got 0 respondents to transforming shelter to do couples and pets that stay with an individual in shelter. Am I remembering that correctly, that we did not get any providers?
I would have to go back and talk to our team who work on our shelter work and just double check that RFP and verify that.
All right. I think the second follow-up question is, the place that we've tried to solve for couples then more recently has been in the hotel motel space. And I know that this is another, in the campaign sphere, everybody's wonderful answer. We do have an open kind of call, but we don't necessarily get to decide how many motels are for sale. As far as you know, is the city still trying to buy motels and hotels? And is there an unlimited supply of these facilities to be able to provide that autonomy and the ability for couples to stay together? Like, can you, and this may be a place where we need follow-up from host, but like, I want to just be realistic about whether or not this is something we're going to be able to answer in the next 12 months in terms of being able to shut, because that's really, this goes away at the end of 2023. So by the end of 2023, will we be able to solve for privacy, autonomy, and couples to the scale we need to turn this interim solution off, is kind of the question that I want to see if you want to weigh in on.
No, I don't think we would be able to ramp up those alternative solutions quickly enough. We are continuing to look for hotels and motels. It is a great option when we have it, and when we're able to purchase those hotels and motels, we love having them, and we're continuing to find and look for more of those opportunities.
Okay. If you have any updates for us on whether that RFP does it just stay open at all times, or do you have to reissue it once a year? That might be helpful for us to understand how aggressively you continue to stay out there looking for those properties. It might be good for us to know that, if you wouldn't mind taking that back to the agency. I will also follow up on that as chair of safety. And then I have a question for Kwika, if I may, if we can re-acknowledge her. I think this question about tents versus tiny homes is a really important one. And I will just say it came up early in the pandemic, right? When honestly, the city was saying, we're really uncomfortable with this solution. Can't we just scale up tiny homes? And you all had some real hard answers about cost, the difficulty of moving tiny homes. Our zoning code continues to prohibit structures with wheels, right? Other than the safe parking areas, you are not able to put these things on wheels, which means you have to move them through incredible cost. And so I just wanted to get a sense from you on why you think we do or don't need to have tents in this text amendment, and whether or not you feel that we could go with a tiny home or structure only option, and the cost differential, just any thoughts you have, because, I think many of us would prefer there not to be any tents. And if you have some thoughts about the trade-offs you've experienced in terms of why this is still, maybe we should or shouldn't have that in the text amendment, since I think it's a really important question my colleagues have raised.
Yeah, absolutely. As being an operator of a safe outdoor space for the last 2 years, and somebody who has formerly experienced unsheltered homelessness myself, do I believe that tents, that this is going to be the solution? No, this is really a temporary response to get folks living in a safe, dignified way that it's safer for them and it's safer for the neighborhood. So it's a win-win solution. As far as the per unit cost, I mean, our tents are about $400 a unit. Pallet shelters are $10,000 a unit. And currently our tiny homes are averaging somewhere around $35,000 a unit. So to maximize the funding that we have available right now, the quickest, easiest way is to scale up safe outdoor spaces because it's more cost effective. And do I believe that tent living is a permanent solution? Absolutely not. I'd like to work my way out of a job because I think everybody that sleeps outside should be indoors. But I do believe that we're not going to be able to meet that need for the right now. So we are a quick right now solution to have folks living in a safe, dignified way to access resources that they need to exist on a basic human level, like bathrooms, hand washing sinks, showers, laundry, and a place that they can call home temporarily while they tackle the immense crisis that a housing crisis entails.
May I just ask one last follow-up question? Is there any difference in terms of site selection for you for a site with tents versus tiny homes, other than the per unit cost? Is that a factor for you at all in terms of the difficulty of finding sites, and why not, going exclusively to tiny homes or pallet shelters?
So, we obviously love our tiny home model, and I'm sure our director of built environment can jump in here, Gray. But we are looking at what it would cost to scale tiny home villages as well. So I'm gonna think that answer is best with Gray.
Gray, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, thank you, Councilman Kanish. So comparing the tiny home village to the safe outdoor space kind of lot and parcel selection, they're both very similar. The tiny home villages take a lot more infrastructure improvements to have, these tiny homes anchored and placed on a site, whereas the safe outdoor spaces can be placed on a parking lot that has a lot quicker of a turnaround. It's available, and the infrastructure is, the ground is ready for people to be on the site, whereas a tiny home village would require us to be laying asphalt, but also anchoring and all of that. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I'd be happy to elaborate more if needed.
Great, thank you, Gray. Okay, great. Two more in queue, and we've got 12 minutes. Councilman Hines.
Thank you, Council President. I also want to thank Councilmember Black for your comment about ADA accessibility, and thank you for bringing visibility to it. As people know, people with disabilities are represented higher in our unhoused population than the standard population. After all, sometimes someone's disability prevents them from holding a standard job or any job at all. So, and we continue to have accessibility challenges, from bus service to accessibility of debate venues, to even getting in and out of City Hall safely. So again, thank you. One question that I keep hearing on the in the conversation in the mayor's race is about hotels and motels. So why can't we just eminent domain hotels and motels? I mean, I think I have an answer to that, but I know that that's something that that has been said before, that we just are just going to take motels from people and say again.
You should ask the city attorney.
We don't have anyone from the city attorney's office.
We do.
Oh, yes. There we go.
Hello.
Thanks, Councilman Hines.
You're welcome.
That's a complicated question. If the city was to move forward with an eminent domain on a hotel or motel, it would have to do it for some public purpose and then potentially pay money out to the hotel or motel, depending on whether it meets that threshold. So it would require a court hearing and a number of other things.
Okay, I guess I'm not sure that fully addresses some of the things that I've heard in the mayor's conversation, or in the conversation in the mayoral debates. But I would just say it is a complicated thing, and some of the comments that I'm hearing from candidates are that it's just simple, we'll just do it. So I guess I'll just leave it there because I did catch you unaware without any sort of prep. So thank you for that. The last thing that I'd want to say is regarding the zoning administrator and that the final determination is in the with the zoning administrator. Right after I took office, I had the pleasure of hosting the conversation about the relocation of the Harm Reduction Action Center. And right after I took office, and there was a quite vocal conversation about where it was located and some concerns from residents nearby about the HRAC's location. And I would say the guidance that I kept getting is that we have things that provide public benefit. And anytime we open up a discussion about public benefit to the community, they'll say, absolutely, we need it. Absolutely can't be next to me. And so at some point, like bus stops or the location of street lights or whatever, we have to understand that we have public benefits, and sometimes those public benefits are for the public's benefit, and by having a discussion, we'll just chase our tails if we continue to ask the community exactly where it should be placed. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you very much. Councilman Black.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to follow up on Councilwoman Kanich's questions about Host having an RFP for a different kind of sheltering model. I did have a meeting with some people from Host. I don't think that you were on it, but because I've been saying for many years now that we ought to adapt large spaces, maybe in unused office buildings. Long before the pandemic, my district was full and is full of old empty office buildings. And I had this idea before the pandemic, and I still think it's an idea. People want a private space, and you can make temporary private spaces that are not a tent. I understand you can't have a tent inside a building because of the fire code, but there are cubicles you can buy for free or take the city's old ones because we have to buy new ones, and give people a private space where they can leave their stuff, they can have their dog, they can lock it, but it's semi-private. So I think I'm not saying it's a competition between a tiny home or a tent. Again, I think people should be inside. And if we need to find a way to get people inside where they have the privacy and that their needs are fulfilled inside. And so I think there are ways to do that without completely redoing a building. You can have temporary cubicles or some kind of temporary walls that give people space. They have real bathrooms in the shelters with real showers. They're not temporary, they're not porta potties. So I just wanted to be very clear on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder for folks, this is a briefing. I'm sure we'll see some additional conversation about this for committee, but I just want to thank CPD, Host, thank you, Polly, Cuica, the whole community, Colorado Village Collaborative team, and folks who are online. Terrell, thank you for being here. And just, I think this proposal is right. I think it has taken lessons learned over the past few years and applied them thoughtfully. No one wants tents for the long term. And we know that current options are not fully accessible, attainable, or utilized. So a variety of options help folks find some stability before being open to having a conversation about permanent housing. And so I think this is one of the things that helps us get there. And I think it's also responsible for us as council members, especially as the city's inundated with proposals during the election, fantasy or not, that we be precise about where we have built guardrails into this. And where there are rules and zoning guidance, things like that. So I appreciate this conversation greatly. And thank you all for tuning in. And thank you, my colleagues. Councilman Kanich, you want to close us out?
Yes, I will make sure that we all get you any maps by email. This will go to the planning board on April 5th. And so if you have any specific feedback on the text amendment itself, the sooner you get that to us, the better. If you have any on the draft that's out there, And then if you need a briefing before we go to Ludi, can you please let Councilman Hines or I or the staff know about that? We won't bug you again for a briefing unless we hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, thank you. We're adjourned.